Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our continuing discussion of the rise of totalitarian regimes in Great Depression era Europe, right? So, very good job in class yesterday. I had an absolute blast with y'all. I can't comprehend what my life will be like as I move forward in this next chapter, but literally, y'all are making it a really, really great, send off into teaching. So, right, I do greatly appreciate y'all. Y'all been nothing but awesome so far, and as of late, for real. So let's go ahead and get back into it though, and keep this flip nice and short, right? So we left off talking about how Hitler is going to follow in the imagery of Mussolini and become the totalitarian fascist regime leader of Germany, right? Now, why I emphasize fascist right there is because it's kind of important to just remember one simple key little thing, that communists also had a leader, right? They had an authoritarian as well. The USSR was being led by Stalin, and he's not a fascist, but he's still a totalitarian, because not all totalitarians are fascists, but fascist dictators are usually totalitarians, right? So same thing with the communist ones. Now look, going into it though, something that you have to understand is that Hitler is going to achieve totalitarianism after Mussolini. Mussolini marches on Rome in 1925, and he also uses a lot of different propaganda and stuff like that. We're going to talk about how Hitler's going to do some very similar things, okay? Now, the thing that you got to understand, though, in his entire story, is Hitler is going to capitalize off of his post-prison popularity. Now, some historians do not believe this to be a major event. I believe this to be a major event. In 1923, what Hitler is going to do is he's going to try to overthrow the Weimar Republic in a coup d'etat. And I love how we just say coup d'etat probably once a class, because it's a really important word and phrase. But he tries to overthrow the government in a coup d'etat in 1923 during this thing called the beer hall putsch, where he actually tries to galvanize people in beer halls to go out and overthrow the Weimar Republic and install a new authoritarian regime, right? Now, he ends up going to jail, and while in jail, he writes a book, right? And that book that he writes is known as Mein Kampf, right? Which is this fractured masculine piece of garbage, all right? That literally he sits there and complains the entire time. It talks about how people that aren't German are to blame for all German problems, and how literally that they should, the Jewish race is one of the biggest contenders of blame, and how the government gave up on World War I, it wasn't us, right? And so basically this book appealed to a lot of those wounded men from post-World War I that were simmering in that post-war bitterness, right? Oh, that's a good line right there. I like that, right? Now, here we go. You have to understand also, though, is that some other leaders, some people like this guy named Goebbels and Himmler and other people are going to help him start this thing known as the Nazi Party, right? Nazis stood for National Socialist, even though they were frankly not socialist at all, right? They were fascist, okay? A lot of people try to be like, well, don't do that in the word. And yeah, well, because at the time, they didn't really define things in that way. Brainiac, read a book. So, now look, going into it, though, you have to understand, he actually gains a mass following using people like Goebbels, who actually runs film for him and shows him how to use the radio. And then he starts some groups called the SA and the SS, respectively known as the brown shirts and the black shirts, and basically forming a militarized political party, right? With a very mass following of bitter soldiers from World War I, right? But then what's going to end up happening is he will be elected in 1933, he will actually be brought in as Chancellor of Germany underneath this guy named President Hindenburg, right? Some of y'all have probably heard of President Hindenburg before because you've heard of that big blimp that's set on fire. So he becomes the Chancellor of Germany in 1933 after a 9-year political campaign. And then what ends up happening is by 1934, he becomes what is known as Der Führer, right? Or the leader of the German people after Hindenburg dies, right? And he uses a lot of different things like the Reichstag fire, a mass following, and all that different propaganda stuff to come to power, right? Speaking of all that different stuff he used, he did a lot of different things to actually do this, because I'm sure a lot of y'all are probably sitting there wondering to yourself, well, Mr. Terry, why would anybody believe this guy? He preaches nothing but hate, right? Well, he's a master of propaganda, right? You have to understand that the people that worked underneath Hitler, I refuse to ever say that this person was brilliant or that he was smart, because literally that's giving him too much credit. But you have to understand a lot of the people that worked underneath him knew how to manipulate really well, right? And they knew what they were doing. We looked at this picture in one of our classes yesterday, talking about how Mussolini and Hitler both create fascist youth organizations, basically like Hitler and Mussolini Boy Scouts, right? This is the Italian fascist youth, and then there was the Hitler youth as well in Germany. They are also going to advocate for women taking back more traditional roles, right? They are basically going to be like, women shouldn't actually be working, they should be waiting, which is what this magazine was called. Or like, okay, Frauenwarte means women wait, and it's showing a woman taking care of a child while a man defends her and then also works. Big turd. So yeah, and they're also going to do public service things like different kinds of exercise classes, vacations, but they're also going to do some massive propaganda as well, including fascist architecture. They're going to build really big buildings that are going to make their like whole like regime look powerful, and they're a very fascist architecture is also very ugly. And so like, and then also throwing this out there as well, they're also going to try and disseminate any thing or concept that they don't like. All right, they're going to try to get rid of it. This right here is an example of that. It's a book burning that was occurring during the Nazi German era, that they burned anything that they felt like reflected negatively on German people. For example, my favorite book on the planet, All Quiet on the Western Front, was burned at one of those book burnings, right? Now, what's going to end up happening though is that after like Hitler comes to power in Germany and Mussolini is already in power in Italy, you're going to see something break out that is a very, very important moment, okay? It's known as the Spanish Civil War. Because from 1936 to 1939, what you're going to see is the Popular Front, which was the left-wing front, versus the fascist military inside of Spain. Because they're being led by this guy named General Francisco Franco, okay? So basically, during the Great Depression, Spain is economically being hit very, very hard. And a war breaks out between a left-wing like government known as the Popular Front and the military that's being led by Francisco Franco, who is a fascist, right? Now, the thing that we also have to understand is that Franco will be supported by Germany and Italy, okay? Franco's going to end up winning this war and become the fascist leader of Spain due to a lot of reasons, but mostly because Western powers did not intervene. People like Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and America did not send troops or aid to this war to try and prevent the fallout or prevent Franco from coming to power. But also, another big thing about this is that Germany and Italy are going to test a very specific war strategy in this. There's this thing that we're going to talk about here in a little bit called the Blitzkrieg, that the Germans let me try that again. There's this thing called the Blitzkrieg that the Germans were very well known for perfecting and using, all right? It actually was first implemented in the Summer Offensive in World War I, and they actually realized at the end of that war, had they done this from the get-go, things would have been a little bit more effective. So they actually decided to try and use it and demonstrate it during the Spanish Civil War, and it ends up showing its merits as being very successful for preventing trench warfare, but then also for winning a war very swiftly. Now, it also, basically, we'll talk about it though, but what a big component of Blitzkrieg is massive bombings using planes and air raids, and this right here is a very famous art piece that actually was made by Pablo Picasso called Guernica, which actually demonstrates the use of the Blitzkrieg, the explosions, the despair, the destruction, and things like that going on in Guernica, a city in Spain, right? And Pablo Picasso actually is from Spain, and so that's of course why he like made this and painted this. It's actually a massive painting. It's absolutely huge. So going into it though, you also have to understand this is the most important set of slides we're going to talk about in this entire flip, right? Mr. Terry, are you sure? Yes, I'm sure, all right? These are the most important slides that we're about to talk about, because literally World War II could have been prevented if, you know, some of these Allied leaders just like, you know, open their eyeballs and decided to think for 2 seconds. Okay, Pierre, you're sitting on my tie. So like, now look, really quick. So you have to understand that this was seen coming for a while. And a lot of it was seen coming because Hitler and Mussolini are going to start pushing the limits of the Treaty of Versailles, right? Now, can you just lay down? So what you have to understand is that why were Mussolini and Hitler able to get away with so much before the start of World War II is a question that I didn't put a question mark on, that I need you to kind of think about while I'm explaining this stuff to you, okay? So this little question right here is like an overarching question on the content that we're about to talk about, okay? And the biggest reason why is because of this concept called appeasement and distrust between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. So going into this next thing, you're going to see something very important, okay? So why were Hitler and Mussolini able to do this? Because of the process of appeasement and the distrust between places like Britain and France and the USSR, who has now collapsed into a Soviet authoritarian regime, right? Now, what's about to happen though, or what I'm about to show you, is how Hitler and Mussolini are going to basically start breaking the rules that were set down by the Treaty of Versailles deliberately, and no one is going to call them out about it, right? No one does anything, and no one tries to prevent them from doing more, right? So here's a great place to start. Italy is going to invade Ethiopia in 1935, right? Now, some of you are immediately like, Mr. Terry, where's Ethiopia? Ethiopia is on the eastern side of Africa, north towards the Horn of Africa, next to Somalia, right? So that is Ethiopia. At the time, it was known as Abyssinia. Now, like, going into it, what you have to understand, though, is that why would they do this? Well, the Italians are under a fascist regime now, right? And so they're trying to make their men feel and really dumb. And so, like, what you have to understand, though, is that in the imperial era in the late 1800s, the Italians had tried to get into the game and tried to take over some imperial colonies, much like their western neighbors. But they tried to invade Abyssinia. They tried to invade what is now modern-day Ethiopia, and they failed at doing that. The Ethiopians were able to actually keep them away and fight them off and use the terrain and some military technology to prevent Italy from ever taking over. So Italy decided under Mussolini to show up in 1935 and to pick up where the other guys didn't do the job right? And then try to make themselves feel better. So you have to understand that this is going to be a big deal because they're not supposed to be continually colonizing places, and also it's just demonstrating something very important, that the Italians have a military that they are willing to use. So it starts freaking a lot of people out. The Western powers could have been like, hey, stop it, and like so, but they did nothing, right? Now the next ones are way more important though, okay? Italy invading Ethiopia was kind of like an early sign things could be going wrong. But also in 1935, the Treaty of Versailles says that Germany can have an army of no more than 100,000 people, that the draft is banned in Germany, that Germany is not allowed to have an air force, that they're not allowed to have submarines, and their navy must be insanely small. Well, Hitler is going to bring back the draft and make an army of 500,000, 5 times larger than the Treaty of Versailles says they can have. 13 million total German soldiers would serve during World War II, which is bananas, all right? So yeah, Hitler creates also the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, and he builds up the Navy, directly violating the Treaty of Versailles. And what do the Allies do? Just like what they did with Italy, they do nothing, right? Britain does nothing, France does nothing, and America does nothing, right? And then in 1936, the Treaty of Versailles says that the Rhineland is to remain a demilitarized zone, right? Now, the Rhineland, for those of y'all who are wondering what that is, it's this western area of Germany next to the Rhine River between the border of Germany and France, right? Or excuse me, on the border of Germany and France. And so a premise of the Treaty of Versailles said that basically no German military was allowed to be in that area, right? Because France didn't want to feel threatened, and also the last time this war broke out, northern France ended up getting destroyed because the Western Front was originally dug there, right? So the Rhineland is supposed to say demilitarized. Well, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland and stuck a massive army there, right? So this is a violation of the Treaty of Versailles. And what did the people do, right? Look at this little area right there, okay? The Rhineland, they're going to stick a military in there. They're not supposed to be able to do that, but they do it anyway. And guess what the Allies do, y'all? Nothing. They did absolutely nothing. And then in 1938, 2 years later, Germany, the Treaty of Versailles says that Germany has to respect the autonomy and statehood of Austria, right? Because Austria speaks the same language as Germany, right? Austria was slightly a part of the German unification movement of 1871. You have to understand, though, that the Treaty of Versailles says, hey, Germany, you cannot do anything to them. They are to remain a state. Well, Germany decides to annex Austria in this event known as the Anschluss, right? Highlight that bad boy. Anschluss. It's good stuff. So yeah, anyway, now, the Anschluss means like the annexation of the taking over of. So like now, what you have to understand though is Hitler is going to annex Austria, and he's going to be like, well, look, they voted for it. And he goes there and has them vote on it. But y'all, look at this ballot. It literally says, do you want to be a part of the German Reich or the German rulership under Adolf Hitler? Yes or no, right? Which is a very creepy ballot because it's like real big yes and a real tiny no. And every time they were turning the ballots in Austria, they literally had to turn it in front of a Nazi officer, right? Which is horrifying. And so what you have to understand though as well, that Germany was supposed to respect the statehood of Austria, and they didn't, and they annexed them and took them over. And so literally the Allies, this is where they finally pull. No, it's not. Actually, I'm lying. They do nothing, all right? They do nothing. Again, in response to all this stuff, the Allies do nothing, right? They just let him keep breaking the Treaty of Versailles and let him keep doing it and let him keep growing his military and let him keep preparing for war. And they did nothing because they thought there was no way that another war like that would break out again, right? Well, they were wrong. But why, we ask? What was the strategy the Allies are adopting here? The strategy they're adopting is a thing known as appeasement, right? Now, what appeasement is the policy of conceding whatever it takes to prevent war, right? That we're going to let this toddler, Hitler, keep doing what he wants to do because as long as we don't go to war, it's fine, right? So this is a great political cartoon of appeasement because it shows Hitler actually doing like the whole nana boo boo and walking over the spineless leaders of democracy, right? So you have to understand that he's walking all over them and doing whatever he wants. And they're not doing anything because they're afraid to get into another war. Well, the thing about it, though, okay, is that appeasement is a bad strategy, and it never really works, especially when he keeps annexing stuff. Because after he annexed Austria and grew the German territorial borders, he then annexes this place called Sudetenland in 1938. Now, some of y'all are like, man, I've just looked at a map of Europe, and I've never seen the Sudetenland. Well, the Sudetenland is this western area of what at the time was the Czechoslovakia, right? This area right here. And he takes that over because he's like, hey, people who speak German live there, and so they are German, so they should be with us, right? And he actually annexes that area, okay? Because some Germans live there. And then Allies give in again, right? But what they do is they have a meeting at this moment, right? They're starting to get threatened and getting very, very worried. And so the Allies decide to sit down with Hitler and be like, yo, dude, you got to stop doing this stuff, right? And Hitler agrees, and he's like, all right, fine. I won't annex anything else. I'll respect everyone's autonomy, whatever. But the Munich Agreement specifically says one really important thing. Don't touch Poland and stop annexing crap, right? The Munich Agreement, Hitler sides, and then also this idiot Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain over there literally thinks that he's going to just prevented war and stuff, but he actually hasn't done squat. Because guess what happens right after he signs the Munich Agreement? In 1939, Hitler annexes the remainder of Czechoslovakia, right? And he does this, and guess what the Allies did, y'all? Nothing. So yeah, they did nothing after this. They appeased him again. But then it finally took this moment to start World War II, right? Because now, even though Hitler's army is completely mobilized and ready to go, September 1st would begin World War I when an unannounced German army invaded Poland using their blitzkrieg tactics in 1939, catapulting Europe into World War I. Britain and France would finally declare war at that moment, leading us into the beginning of World War I, whenever Hitler invaded Poland and after he annexed Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland and Austria and all this other stuff, right? So going into it, what you have to understand is we're now looking at the very first phases of the war of Europe, the very first phases of World War II. And at the very beginning of this war, you have to understand something very important. We've got the Axis powers on one side. Remember how in World War I we had the Central powers? Well, now we have the Axis powers, right? And the Axis powers are made up of Germany, Italy, and Japan, okay? Now, some of you are like, where's Japan coming from? We'll talk about them in a little bit, all right? So, allies are going to be France and Britain. Does that team seem a little small to y'all? Now, that team seems a little bit tiny because what about Russia? Okay, where are they? Well, that's a really great question, y'all. The thing about it is that the Russians actually signed an agreement to not go into World War II with Hitler, okay? Because he actually created an early agreement known as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact on August 23rd, 1939, which is only a few days before he decided to go and invade Poland. So what would happen is Joseph Stalin would meet with Nazi ambassadors to actually sign an agreement saying that they would not attack each other, right? Now, this agreement's really interesting because basically the Nazis are like, you're not one of our allies and you will not fight with us, but you will not help anybody that is fighting against us. And then the Soviets agreed and said the same thing. And they agreed to, the provisions of this agreement were one, they were going to split Poland in half, and the eastern side was going to go to the USSR, and the western side was going to go to Germany, trade industry goods from Germany for Russian grains, and don't aid any enemy of either side. Now, a lot of this also has to do with the fact that the Russians want to go off and fight a different war. They want to actually go fight this thing called the Winter War against the Finns, right? Against Finland from 1939 to 1940, which they go and do, and they win, but we'll talk more about that in class, and the U.S. would remain neutral, right? Now, did the Axis learn from World War I, though? Because remember this entire thing, and it seems like they did, right? Remember the Schlieffen Plan and its failure. Remember all that stuff and how it failed miserably in the early phases of World War I. Well, the question that you have to ask yourself is, did the Axis learn from World War I? But we'll talk about that in class, all right? And I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.